Before the 70s took over, these 25 bands were the heartbeat of the 60s. Are you ready to relive the era of rock's greatest forgotten legends? You won't want to miss this nostalgic journey. 25. Fleetwood Mac.
The group we're talking about is Fleetwood Mac, and they play the blues.
We're now going to do our latest single called
I tell you about my life. They say I'm a man.
Imagine a band that fused rock, blues, and folk into a captivating sound. Fleetwood Mac started just like that.
I can't help about the shape I'm in.
The band was formed in 1967 in London. It comprised Peter Green, Mick Fleetwood, Jeremy Spencer, and John McVie.
I guess I've got everything I need.
Fleetwood Mac is known for hit songs such as Go Your Own Way, The Chain, Landslide, Dreams, and Little Lies. Their music fused rock, folk, blues, art pop, and soft rock to create progressive rock music. 24. The Doors.
It would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar.
From their dark lyrics to the mysterious persona of Jim Morrison, the Doors embodied the darker side of the 60s. For Rolling Stone, one of the elements that made the Doors so important was the recognition that, amidst all the flower power hippie sentimentality that dominated mid-60s mainstream rock, the decade had a dark side. Drugs, Vietnam, fierce national divisions. In that sense, the band was the embodiment of that era. Their music wasn't angry or particularly heavy. In fact, the band didn't even have a bass player, opting instead for organist Ray Manzarek to hold down the low end of the songs.
Yeah, back to the road has got again. Take me, Spanish caravan.
And like other bands of their era, the guys in the Doors looked like anyone you'd run into on the street. But it was all dark and mysterious and rebellious and exciting in its own way. Perhaps, in fact certainly, frontman Jim Morrison indulged in that darkness because he was intimately familiar with the hedonism and drug abuse his music channeled the energy of. The article goes on to describe the Lizard King as something of a rebel without a cause, whose behavior stemmed from personal pain rather than any organized political viewpoint, and whose untimely death has both rehabilitated and immortalized his music as a symbol of youthful rebellion.
Winds find galleons lost in the sea. I know where treasure.
In another Rolling Stone article in which the Doors are listed as the 41st greatest artist of all time, Marilyn Manson writes, "They didn't sound anything like punk rock, but Morrison outshined everyone else when it came to rebellion and not playing by anyone else's rules." 23. Os Mutantes. Ever heard of psychedelic rock with a Brazilian twist? Os Mutantes mixed bossa nova and psych rock in the most bizarre way. When people talk about psychedelic rock, they often think of American psych bands like The Doors, Grateful Dead, or Strawberry Alarm Clock. Rarely do people think of Brazil when it comes to psych, even though Brazil had a very active and talented psychedelic scene during the late 60s. Os Mutantes are a perfect blend of Brazilian psych and bossa nova. Sure, they're a bit out there, but that is what made them so enjoyable. They are so unique and distinguishable from all other psych bands of the time. Their vocals are just so soothing, and the music speaks for itself. A blend of relaxing Brazilian riffs and a bizarre psych atmosphere really made Os Mutantes one of the greatest overlooked psych bands. 22. The Zombies.
Rodney Terence Argent, Hugh Birch Grundy, Paul Ashley Warren Atkinson, Christopher Taylor White, Colin Edward Michael Blunstone.
Tell her no, 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 no.
A band often lost in the British invasion shuffle, the Zombies were masters of jazzy rock with lush harmonies and haunting tunes. Sure, when most people think of the British invasion, they think of the Beatles, the Kinks, and the Rolling Stones. But the Zombies are one of the most puzzling groups often forgotten. Many label the Zombies a three-hit wonder since they only had 3 big hits in America: Time of the Season, Tell Her No, and She's Not There. But many fail to realize the Zombies crafted very fine albums and were one of the few bands whose songwriting could rival that of the Beatles.
Well, no one told me about her, the way she lied. Down loving love from your arms.
The Zombies were a jazz rock sort of band fronted by keyboardist Rod Argent, who wrote most of the band's songs. Most of their early material consists of fast-paced rock and roll similar to the Animals, with lots of organ at the front and bluesy guitar. One thing that particularly stands out is the jazzy vocals of Rod Argent, who had one of the greatest voices of the 60s. His voice helped define the Zombies. The Zombies crafted some of the finest albums of their time, despite only really creating 3 albums. 4 if you count the material recorded during the Odyssey and Oracle sessions that would later be compiled into a lost album.
And to find her, she's not there. Well, let me tell you about the way she. Don't leave me now for her love.
Odyssey and Oracle is one of the finest moments of pop music history, rightfully earning a spot in the top 100 albums of all time. The brilliant lyrics of Rod Argent and psychedelic pop influences are nothing short of brilliant and almost put the Beatles to shame. The Zombies are just a very beautiful band to listen to, creating fast-driven, catchy rock and roll set to brilliant psychedelic pop. They were truly a very diverse band with incredible influences. It's a shame they had to break up after Odyssey and Oracle. 21. The Who.
No one knows what it's like to be hated. Fade away. Don't try and dig what we all
Before the guitar smashing and ear-shattering performances, The Who was rewriting rock rules, creating anthems that still resonate today. Any conversation about the origins of hard rock simply must include a proper tribute to The Who. As Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder writes for Rolling Stone, who listed The Who as the 29th greatest musical artist ever, They wanted to be louder, so they had Jim Marshall invent the 100-watt amp. Needed more volume, so they began stacking them. It is said that the first guitar feedback ever to make it to record was on Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere in 1965. He continues talking about Pete Townshend's guitar smashing. And of course, any rock fan knows late drummer Keith Moon trashed hotel rooms, per Ultimate Classic Rock. Others have done the same, but they did it first. But the Who's legacy stretches beyond power chords and partying until dawn. The Who told stories within the confines of a song, continues Vedder, and over the course of an entire album, pushed boundaries. He goes on to say, The Who quite possibly remain the greatest live band ever. That's subjective, but watch their shows and it's hard to argue that they don't deserve to be part of that conversation. On My Generation, Pete Townshend famously shouted, "I hope I die before I get old." It didn't happen. He and frontman Roger Daltrey, who still has that golden voice, are in their 70s. But as folk rocker Willie Nile said, according to a 2010 New York Post article, they're still playing. Obviously it's not the 60s, 70s, or 80s, but the glory's still there. 20. Lynyrd Skynyrd.
Mr. Young, sing about her. Well, I heard on me, he'll put her down.
From Florida swamps to rock stardom, Lynyrd Skynyrd's southern rock anthems like Freebird still echo in the hearts of fans. This band is an American group that was based in Florida. The band comprised Ronnie Van Zant, Gary Rossington, Bob Burns, and Larry Junstrom. They focused on the subgenre of southern rock and are instrumental in making it popular. They are famous for hit songs like Freebird, Simple Man, Tuesday's Gone, Gimme 3 Steps, and Sweet Home Alabama. 19. Jethro Tull, a band that dared to blend classical, jazz, and rock like no other. Jethro Tull's flute-led melodies were an unforgettable experience. They are a British band created in 1967. Jethro Tull made unique sounds in rock and roll influenced by classical music. The band was able to utilize instruments such as the flute to make their sound their own. Jethro Tull first played a mixture of jazz and blues rock before venturing out to a progressive rock sound. The band consisted of Ian Anderson, the only constant member, Martin Barr, John Evan, Andrew Giddings, John Glasscock, Jonathan Noyce, Dee Palmer, and Doane Perry. Jethro Tull was best known for songs such as Beggar's Farm, Teacher, Thick as a Brick, Aqualung, and Too Old to Rock and Roll. 18. The Byrds. The Byrds created a blend of folk and psychedelia that would shape rock music, echoing influences across decades and bands alike. The Byrds were sort of the psychedelic folk band and were pretty good at creating some laid-back folk rock, almost similar in atmosphere to what the Beatles were doing on Rubber Soul. In fact, I'm pretty sure most of Rubber Soul was influenced by the Byrds, especially Harrison's songs. The Byrds also had David Crosby of Crosby, Stills and Nash. They had some pretty cool guitar riffs and their harmonies were pretty catchy. In fact, if any band reminded us so much of the Beatles when it came to songwriting and harmony structure, the Byrds are one of the closest, and this is a good thing. These guys pretty much created the atmosphere and style of the Beatles' 1965 period before the Beatles, and that deserves some credit. The Byrds built an extensive family tree of significant pop and rock bands. Roger McGuinn, Gene Clark, David Crosby, Chris Hillman, Michael Clark, Graham Parsons, Winter Haven, and Clarence White make up the band. The Byrds were best known for songs like You Ain't Going Nowhere, All I Really Wanna Do, Fifth Dimension, My Back Pages, and Mr. Tambourine Man. 17. The Velvet Underground. They were the outsiders of the 60s, pushing boundaries with experimental sounds. The Velvet Underground were ahead of their time. The Velvet Underground, the band led by Lou Reed, is one of those bands you always hear about but never hear. As Julian Casablancas points out for Rolling Stone, which ranked Velvet Underground the 19th greatest artist of all time, their music is almost non-existent on classic rock radio. Why is it always Boston and Led Zeppelin, he writes, and why are the Rolling Stones so much more popular than the Velvets? But there is also a part of me that has always felt that it should have been the other way around. There's an argument to be made for that. Casablancas goes on to say that the Velvets were ahead of their time and just plain weird, in the best way, and that their experimental music could transport you and teach you how to be yourself. High praise, but how influential were they really? The BBC asks a provocative question. Are they as important to music history as the Beatles? It claims that the Velvets' 4 studio records contain the DNA of everything from indie and alternative rock to nearly all forms of punk. Then it lists some artists who cite the Velvets as a foundational influence. The names are impressive. U2, the Sex Pistols, R.E.M., the Talking Heads, Sonic Youth. You're unlikely to stumble across Velvet Underground tunes on your morning commute, but if you like any alternative bands at all, you owe it to them to check out the 60s group that made it all possible. 16. Jefferson Airplane. Psychedelic rock's West Coast heroes, Jefferson Airplane, defined the late 60s with their trippy soundscapes and rebellious spirit. Jefferson Airplane were mainly known for their psychedelic music, appearing at Woodstock, and of course having a female lead singer. I'm not the biggest Jefferson Airplane fan, but their singles were fantastic. And on top of that, their riffs were always pretty cool, and they had the psychedelic atmosphere down pretty well too. Grace Slick was pretty much the standout member of the group, and she had a pretty good voice that suited the psychedelic style well, not to mention the amount of range her voice had. Jefferson Airplane were all about the late 60s, and if any band summed up the West Coast atmosphere of the late 60s, I'd probably place Jefferson Airplane at the top, well, along with Grateful Dead. Their music helped define an entire culture, and they deserve lots of credit for that. 15. The Allman Brothers. Blending blues, jazz, and rock, the Allman Brothers' jam-heavy, soulful sound created a legacy that's still celebrated today. The band was created in the late 60s in Florida. The Allman Brothers thrived greatly by mixing blues, jazz, hard rock, and classical music uniquely. The band consisted of 2 brothers, Greg Allman and Dwayne Allman, together with Jay Johanny Johansson and Butch Trucks. Their popular hit songs include Dreams, In Memory of Elizabeth, Blue Sky, Statesboro Blues, and Ramblin' Man. 14. The Beatles. The Beatles were more than just a band. They were cultural icons who redefined music and left an unshakable legacy. It hardly needs to be said. The Beatles aren't just the greatest band of the 1960s, but are in the running for the most important musical artist of all time. So says Rolling Stone anyway, on its list of greatest artists. It's one of those lists where fans can argue themselves to death over who should outrank who or be included at all. But few would argue with the placement of the Beatles at the top of that pile. Elvis Costello had the honor of writing their entry here. Every record was a shock when it came out, he said, noting that Beatles albums had a tendency to redefine what was even possible in music, which another Rolling Stone article agrees with. They made writing your own material expected rather than exceptional. This was a band that seemed to know it wouldn't stick together forever, and it set out to revolutionize music as much as possible in just a few years in the late 60s. What's strange is that they weren't even performing live for a good chunk of that short span. NME says they stopped doing concerts well before their split because the crowds drowned out their playing. Elvis Costello continues, noting that even today, when he saw Paul McCartney play Beatles hits all these years later, the crowd's reaction was so intense that it all but drowned the song out. It was very thrilling, but also rather disconcerting. The songs weren't theirs anymore. They were everybody's. 13. The Kinks. The Kinks pioneered the power chord, influencing punk, metal, and beyond. Yet they remain one of rock's most underappreciated innovators. The Kinks are often cited as some of the earliest innovators of punk rock. They were one of the first groups to almost exclusively use the power chord in their guitar riffs. Sure, there were guys before them like Link Wray and Howlin' Wolf's guitarist who used the power chords before them, but the Kinks revolutionized the use of the power chord, and it was mainly their use of that chord that helped popularize it, which led to them influencing other bands. The power chord has since become a staple in punk, metal, and hard rock. Bands like Metallica, Deep Purple, the Ramones, and AC/DC have the Kinks to thank for their work with the power chord. As the 60s progressed, the Kinks evolved from a sort of generic rock and roll band into more of a pop band with lots of horn segments, similar to what the Beatles were doing. The Kinks made some of the best pop music of all time. The Kinks are highly catchy, and their lyrics reflect lots of sarcasm and humor. The Kinks may not have been as popular as the Beatles, loud as The Who, or wild as the Rolling Stones, but their impact on music history is just as great. They managed to do something different than any other British invasion or any other band for that matter, and they did it best. The Kinks easily have some of my favorite harmonies, and Ray Davies crafted some very clever and cynical lyrics to go along with his happy-sounding songs. The Kinks were one of the most cynical, happy-sounding bands ever. I just love the way Ray Davies sings and the way their songs flow. The Kinks relied on many catchy, repetitive riffs, and this is what made them so enjoyable. They are just such a fun band to listen to and are easily one of the most clever ones. 12. Traffic. With eclectic instrumentals and a knack for blending genres, Traffic crafted a distinct sound that still feels fresh and experimental. Traffic, an English band, was created in 1967 in Birmingham. It started as a psychedelic rock band, but later changed its sound using new instruments such as keyboards and reed instruments in their music. The band has thrived more with albums than releasing singles. The band consisted of Steve Winwood, Jim Capaldi, Dave Mason, and Chris Wood. Traffic was popularly known for songs like Medicated Goo, Paper Sun, Pearly Queen, You Can All Join In, and Freedom Rider. 11. The United States of America. A band that came and went in a flash, the United States of America left behind one of the great lost psychedelic albums. The USA reminds me of why I love psych music so much. These guys came out of nowhere and created one incredible psych album, and as soon as they were done, they were gone. Actually, it was pretty common in the late 60s for bands to do that, create one or two albums and then disband. My guess is due to not making enough record sales. I mean, the late 60s was overflooded with so many interesting psych bands, and if they didn't produce any hits, the record labels had no use for them. USA created some of the greatest psych rock of their time using repetitive riffs, bizarre sound effects, and distorted guitars. Their riffs were just so catchy and some amazing vocals, particularly Dorothy Moskowitz, who reminds me of Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane a little. I can't praise these guys enough for creating one of my favorite psych albums, and definitely were underlooked for their time. 10. Sly and the Family Stone. Sly and the Family Stone broke barriers with their diverse lineup and genre-defying sound, blending funk, rock, and social commentary. Led by the brilliant if unpredictable Texas-born Sylvester Stewart, aka Sly Stone, San Francisco's Sly and the Family Stone are unquestionably one of the most groundbreaking outfits among the best 60s bands. The first major American rock act to feature a racially integrated mixed-gender lineup, they formed late in 1966 and pioneered a potent psychedelic soul sound all their own. blending elements of soul, funk, R&B, rock, and psychedelia. Regulars in the top 10 of the Billboard Hot 100 during the late 60s, with evergreen hits such as Dance to the Music, Everyday People, and Thank You, the Family Stone also released critically acclaimed albums such as Life and 1969's excellent Stand, which married hard-hitting social commentary with a dynamic pop sensibility. Arguably one of the biggest bands in the US by the end of the decade, they played rapturously received shows at both the Harlem Cultural Festival and at Woodstock during the summer of 1969, and retained their popularity during the early 70s thanks to further landmark releases such as 1971's There's a Riot Going On and 1973's Fresh. 9. The Beach Boys. Surf's Up. The Beach Boys crafted the perfect soundtrack for the California Dream, defining an entire genre with their sun-soaked tunes. In the 1960s, if the UK had a Beatles, the US counterpart was the Beach Boys. This pop rock band defined the California sound with their music. Formed in 1961 in Hawthorne, California, with a lineup consisting of Brian Wilson, Carl Wilson, Dennis Wilson, Mike Love, and Al Jardine, the Beach Boys became known for their close harmonies and surf-themed songs. Many of their albums during the decade, such as Pet Sounds and Surf's Up, hit high on the charts and are considered essential listening for any fan of surf rock music. 8. Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company. Janis Joplin's powerful voice was the heart of Big Brother and the Holding Company, defining the sound of the late 60s. Next, we turn to one of the first female rock stars, Janis Joplin, whose powerful vocals helped to define the sound of the 60s with the band Big Brother and the Holding Company. This group has had a lot of different players over the years, but the classic lineup is considered Joplin on vocals, Sam Andrew on guitar, James Gurley on guitar, Dave Getz on drums, and Peter Albin on bass. They got together in San Francisco, California in 1966 and were known for their psychedelic sound and Joplin's soulful vocals. Joplin and Big Brother released 2 studio albums in the 1960s, but their most popular one was Cheap Thrills, which reached number 1 on the Billboard 200 when it was released in 1968. 7. Creedence Clearwater Revival. CCR's swampy southern rock anthems defined a generation. Proud Mary and Fortunate Son still resonate as timeless classics. Consisting initially of John Fogerty, Tom Fogerty, Stu Cook, and Doug Clifford, Creedence Clearwater Revival, CCR, was formed in 1959 as the Blue Velvets in El Cerrito, California. They became Creedence only in 1967. The group had quite big hits during the end of the 60s, with a series of top 10 hits climbing the charts, including Proud Mary, Bad Moon Rising, and Fortunate Son. Sadly, despite their rising popularity, Creedence Clearwater Revival disbanded in 1972 following the separation of John Fogerty from the band. Clifford and Cook continued and created Creedence Clearwater Revisited. 6. Cream. Before Eric Clapton was a solo icon, he was part of Cream, one of rock's first supergroups with a sound like no other. Back when iconic guitarist Eric Clapton was part of music groups, Cream was one that he formed with Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker in 1966. They were known for their innovative sound, which blended blues and hard rock. The band rose to fame with their first album, Fresh Cream. However, it was their 1967 album Disraeli Gears that featured one of their most famous singles, Sunshine of Your Love. This is one song every budding bassist and guitarist will learn at some point. As the band who landed a spot on Rolling Stone's 100 Greatest Artists of All Time list, they greatly influenced many future musicians, including Jimi Hendrix. Their works have earned them multiple Grammy Awards as well as an induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. 5. Santana. Santana's Latin-infused rock sound was unlike anything else in the 60s. Their Woodstock performance was legendary, setting the stage for their success. This is a Latin band with tremendous success with its first album release performance in 1969 at Woodstock. Santana uniquely combines Latin blues, rock, salsa, and jazz with African rhythms. The band consisted of Carlos Santana, the only consistent member, David Brown, Jose Arias, Michael Shreve, Greg Raleigh, and Michael Carabello. Santana has been among the best bands globally with more than 47 million albums sold in America and around 100 million sold around the world. 4. Simon and Garfunkel.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Because of vision softly creeping.
Folk rock icons of the 60s, Simon and Garfunkel's poetic songs and harmonies captured the spirit of a generation.
In restless dreams I walked alone. For our fight, we'd like to help you learn to help yourself. I wish I was homeward bound.
While they might not be considered a band by the usual definition, Simon and Garfunkel were a folk rock songwriting duo who were one of the best-selling artists in the 60s.
Silent, and in the naked light I saw
In the wells of silence.
The duo formed in 1963 and released their debut album, Wednesday Morning 3 a.m., the following year to moderate success. Not deterred, they released 3 more in the 60s, with the last 2 becoming commercial hits.
Tonight I'll sing my songs again, I'll play the game and pretend. Gone away, hey, 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 hey. On the subway walls and tenement halls.
The Sound of Silence, which is part of their second album of the same name, helped put them on the map. Other hits of the decade like Mrs. Robinson, Homeward Bound, and I Am a Rock all charted well. 3. Led Zeppelin. Rock gods of the 70s, Led Zeppelin was already creating their iconic sound in the late 60s with blues-infused rock anthems. Led Zeppelin focused on the heavy rock music genre. While their best decade was the 70s, we also had to include them in the 60s list. They pioneered using sophisticated sound systems and light and are best known for their masterpiece, Stairway to Heaven. This song is believed to have gotten the most airplay on the radio than any song has ever received in the music industry. The band greatly impacted the music industry, especially stadium rock. 2. Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd's early years were a trip, literally. Their experimental psychedelia set the foundation for their iconic atmospheric sound. Pink Floyd would develop into one of rock's biggest acts during the 70s, but they achieved so much during their formative years that they warrant inclusion in any self-respecting list of the best 60s bands. Initially fronted by the mercurial Syd Barrett, the Cambridge Quartet quickly found success, their dark, whimsical psych pop chiming with 1967's Summer of Love and resulting in both the band's debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and their glorious second single, See Emily Play, both going top 10 in the UK. As Barrett struggled with fame and chose to withdraw from public life, his bandmates brought in guitarist David Gilmour, and Pink Floyd changed direction. Issued in 1968 and 1969 respectively, the albums A Saucerful of Secrets and Uma Guma chronicled the group's shift from psychedelia toward the atmospheric prog rock sound with which they would make their fortune during the 70s. 1. The Rolling Stones. The epitome of rock and roll rebellion, the Rolling Stones' blues-infused rock sound and defiant attitude shaped an entire genre. You've probably heard it said a million times that classic rock bands and artists had their stylistic roots in the blues. So did the Rolling Stones, of course. According to You Discover Music, the blues is such an intimate part of their sonic DNA that they even took their name from a Muddy Waters song. Then, as per the same article, they went on to bring blues to a wider audience. But its influence on the Rolling Stones didn't come close to stopping there. Their songs, via AllMusic, Satisfaction, Paint It Black, Get Off My Cloud, Sympathy for the Devil, You Can't Always Get What You Want, Jumpin' Jack Flash, and so on, are timeless hits and still some of the most commonly heard tunes on classic rock radio. The article notes they also made iconic album covers and even influenced fashion, playing a huge role in replacing the suits and bowl cuts look of old school 50s artists with the longer hair and wilder colors we more typically associate with rock stars. And it's worth noting that in a recent poll per The Independent, their tongue and lip logo beat out the Nike swoosh and the Batman symbol to become the most iconic t-shirt logo ever. But perhaps the Stones' greatest legacy to the world of rock was their attitude. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards still embody the sneering, rebellious spirit of rock and roll, despite somehow surviving long enough to become respected elder statesmen of the genre at large. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into the 60s, smash that like button and subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out our other videos for more music history deep dives. See you next time.